So content warning if you have issues around claustrophobia and enclosed spaces, because oh boy. So if your TikTok algorithm is anything like mine, it'll have gone through an inexplicable spelunking phase at some point, where it would show you these extremely popular videos that were some kind of variant of the following. There'd be some person who'd be wandering around and they'd just find a hole or some crevice. Sometimes this would be in a cave they were already in, sometimes it would be the entryway to a potential cave. In the really popular ones, these holes often would be like roughly just wide enough to tightly fit around the body of the person discovering them. To the point that if these people made the mistake of consuming so much as a pea or inhaling too much air while in the hole would presumably just mercilessly crush their bones into dust for daring to even attempt it. And these holes would always be like pitch black. You know it's never a hole where there's a good degree of visibility. It would always be a hole where it looked like the bowels of hell had opened up themselves to reveal the infinite abyss within them. These were the kind of holes that could not possibly contain anything other than spiders and Satan, and then for some insane reason, the people in these videos would whip out some Junji bullshit, morph themselves into human slugs, and climb into the holes, wriggling and writhing their bodies to snake themselves inside. And they do this for fun. And look, no disrespect to the spelunking community, you're all braver than I am, but there is not a single particle of my soul that could begin to comprehend the way your brains are wired. Like, go wild, have fun, enjoy yourselves, but also, what is wrong with you? In these videos, you wouldn't be able to look away because how could you? They were so anxiety inducing, you'd think you were having a heart attack watching them. You couldn't possibly look away because you need to see that these people made it through or got out alive, because otherwise the last image you have when you scroll away is just some stranger tightly sandwiched in the crust of an uncaring earth, presumably never to be heard from again. And the problem was, the more you watched them, the more TikTok would be like, oh, we have a big spelunking fan on our hands. And it would give you more, adding a little spice each time to keep it engaging. The holes would get smaller. The people would have a harder time navigating gaps, and eventually you'd get to the stuck videos, which would often go on for like a series of 5 vids, where some poor sod would just be absolutely trapped in some stony prison as people tried to rescue them, and you wouldn't be able to find the last entry because it hadn't been uploaded yet, so you didn't know if they got out. And dear God, no, these vids are horrible. Just truly skin-crawling stuff. The kind of video loop you do not accidentally want to fall into just before bed for fear of nightmares. And they'd always be like maybe 2 to 5 minutes long. Now what if I told you that there was a film that took that subject matter, replicated the horrible anxiety and pit in your stomach that you get from these vids, and made you endure it not for a little 2 to 5 minute video that at least usually ended with some sigh of relief, but instead a brutal and unrelenting 1 hour and 39 minutes that just gets worse and more dire every second and has absolutely no respite to offer you its whole runtime? And then what if I told you that it was actually awesome? That's The Descent, a 2005 British horror film. The Descent follows Sarah, a thrill-seeking woman who enjoys going on adventures with her equally thrill-seeking friends, whose life is turned upside down when a car crash kills her husband and daughter. 1 year later, and still racked with grief, Sarah is invited out to join her old mates and some new ones they've picked up on a little spelunking expedition in North Carolina by her friend Juno, who, after the accident and Sarah's descent into depression following it, has grown a little distant from Sarah. The 6 women have a wee hike and get to this admittedly stunning cave entrance and have a wander inside. There, Juno attempts to reconnect with Sarah, but before we can have a nice little tale about old mates reaching out to help pull you through hard times, everything goes to hell, with a cave-in that manages to be the first of many of the most terrifyingly claustrophobic occurrences you will ever see in a film. This occurs at, I don't know, maybe around the 15 to 30 minutes mark. What follows with the remaining hour and a bit of runtime is just the bleakest, most unpleasant, most skin-itchingly claustrophobic ramp-up of tension you will ever experience. If you are a fan of horror films where the characters within them have a really bad time, you're gonna have a really good time, because, oh god, do these girls have a bad time in these caves. These women probably have the worst possible time they could have. I do not think there is anything you could add to this film that would make their situation worse. Except maybe a spider. I will give them that small silver lining. They don't see a spider. So that's good. On the other hand, everything that could possibly go wrong in this situation absolutely does. Injuries? Yep. To almost all of them. Falls? Oh, to their deaths, straight up. Chance of rescue or escape? Absolutely none whatsoever. Welcome to literal hell. On paper, this is the kind of horror film I wouldn't normally like. Those of you who are long-time watchers will remember my whole reason for starting Wholesome Halloween was to examine the positive messaging in horror. My stance on the genre is that it is at its strongest not just when it exposes us to human trauma, but when it shows us that through often nothing more than the indomitable human spirit, the trauma can be overcome. Put your characters through whatever hellish nightmare you want for me, but I like it best when they make it out the other end in some way better than they were before. Whether that's braver, more resilient, with a new friend in hand, whatever works. Just throw us a bone, you know? I like the tender terror. The Descent though, oh, it is anything but tender. It is cutthroat. It is nasty. It is downright nihilistic. There's not a shred of positivity to be taken away from this thing. There's not even the tiny small victory of the now distant friends Juno and Sam at least reconnecting with one another. The whole reason for this trip in the first place, we don't even get that. Honestly, the greatest kindness someone does to a friend in this film is euthanizing her by bashing her head in with a rock. And it is like this without ever slowing down. It doesn't so much pause to give the characters or even you a moment to catch your breath. From the second that first cave-in happens all the way through to the credits roll, it is dark, it is mean, and it will make you endure it. In theory, I should hate this. There are some exceptions, but I don't tend to gravitate towards the nihilistic stuff. I don't really vibe with it when horror films seem to almost have active contempt for their characters, especially their perfectly likeable characters that don't deserve this maliciousness. There's nothing wrong with those films exactly, and if you like that, more power to you. I just personally tend to find that this maliciousness can often be used as a shortcut to shock value, and generally speaking, I don't often get too much from that. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I need a happy ending or anything. Plenty of films I like are bleak and end on real dour and depressing notes. But they don't feel, I don't know, cruel. If a film ends miserably, and I like it, it's usually because that depressing ending feels like it has something to say, even if the characters don't win or survive or must suffer as a result of the narrative direction. The films I enjoy that do this still tend to feel like the narrative itself is on those characters' side, like the story is as sad or angry about the unfairness of their treatment as you are, if that makes sense. Something like The Mist would be a good example. Without spoiling it, that film's ending is harsh, but it doesn't approach its conclusion in an uncaring or brutal manner. It's bleak, but it rightfully sells this bleakness as heartbreaking. It leaves you feeling a lot, and none of it good, but it treats the characters who suffer this ending with the utmost respect. It ain't gonna make you happy, but it also won't certainly make you feel cold. The Descent possibly could make you leave feeling cold. I want to stress that I don't want to be reductionist here. I don't think this film doesn't respect its characters. You can tell just in how much they get to fight for their survival in a manner that makes them come off so strongly, and how much Sam's trauma and grief are so centrally focused on her relationship with Juno expanded upon, and how generally likeable, grounded and believable the girls are, that the film is inherently interested in them as people. They are not just avatars to exist in order to be subjected to misery. But regardless, does not shy away from that misery. It's definitely nihilistic. But you know what? Even though that wouldn't usually be my bag, when the execution is this good and the craft on display is this flawless, you can absolutely make that tone work. And holy shit does The Descent work. The Descent is absolutely perfect at what it does. It is hell. It's a journey into hell. Both literally and thematically, in this film, the characters are constantly going downwards. Physically, emotionally, and mentally. Everything is a descent into hell itself. They descend into the cave, they crawl lower through its systems, their physical bodies are punished, ripped and torn to shreds, their friendships are tested, and as they get lower and lower and lower, the claustrophobia gets tighter, the discoveries get worse, and the colour palette and lighting gets a deeper and deeper red. By the third act, the cave barely even looks like a cave anymore. It literally just looks like a full-on biblical hell. The film is a vivid and brutal painting of the fall into a pit of despair, brought to life through the physical, metaphorical space of an actual pit, one that can't be climbed out of. Something that, when you think about, is a lot like how, say, grief might feel when you're in the midst of it. On first viewing, the car crash at the beginning of the film might feel disjointed from the rest of it. It's such a brief scene and so disconnected from the actual main focus of the film, the cave expedition. By both being such a small part of the narrative and also being separated by a time skip, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was just another symptom of the film being cruel to its characters. A simple catalyst to create a reason for some distance between Sarah and Juno. Or you might even wonder why it's there, since it's revealed in the film that they have other reasons to have tension between them anyway. And why don't we just start straight away on getting ready for the expedition? But I think it's inherently what the film is about in a way. Think about how the cave diving reflects Sarah's experiences. We're told through dialogue that Sarah has become disconnected from her friends, and this is the first time they're reconnecting, and that it's a whole year later. What does that tell us about the year that Sarah has had? The last thing we see of her before the time skip is her wailing in abject pain on the hospital floor upon realization of her family's death. And then everything that happens after that, but before we see her again 1 year later, is implied. We know through performance and dialogue after Sarah joins the group on their cave diving that she is still very much in this period of grief. This to me communicates Sarah has already experienced a descent she can't crawl out of. She's already experienced a hell of her own. She had descended into grief, into sadness, into despair. In the cave, everyone experiences a hell so brutal their hope slowly distinguishes. Their mental health and their friendships deteriorate. This presumably parallels Sarah's past year. In the cave, they begin to feel hopeless. Sarah has presumably felt hopeless for a while now. In the cave, friendships are lost and torn apart by tragic, violent occurrences. A tragic and violent act tore Sarah away from her friends this past year. The cave has everybody go through a horrifying and inescapable hell. Sarah is already in hell. There is no greater hell than losing your loved ones. It's tough stuff, but man, does it strike a chord that feels like such an emotional truth. And this whole metaphor and its metaphorical parallels would totally fall apart if the film wasn't executing this idea at such a high level. But every facet of it communicates this vision with perfect articulation. The cave is a nightmare so fully realized that after I saw the film, I immediately asked myself, how? How could you possibly do what these filmmakers have done and do it safely? This film must have been so incredibly dangerous to make. We're probably lucky no one actually got seriously hurt or died. Imagine my shock when I looked up the behind the scenes to find that the cave that acts as the surprisingly varied setting for around 90% of this movie was all created from 21 different sets built in Pinewood Studios by an unbelievably talented production designer by the name of Seymour Bowles. And in hindsight, of course they were. Some of the stuff that happens in this movie would have been wildly irresponsible to film in real settings. Not to mention crazy expensive and time consuming. And yet, through Neil Blomkamp's incredible directions, the filmmaking team's brilliant cinematography and framing, and Bowles' truly unreal designs, so convincing was the illusion that these caves were a completely real place, my brain didn't even think to consider the much more obvious and likely reality that they would just be fake. Even just looking at the set photos, you could easily be convinced at first glance that you're looking at a picture of the interior of a cave until you notice the studio elements in the edges of the frame. So fully realised are these designs, and they are shot just beautifully. You wouldn't think it for a film that is just a hellish nightmare mostly set in dark underground locations, but Blomkamp manages to make some truly striking images out of just these sets and some clever lighting. There's real beauty in this horror. He still manages to find the style amongst all of the realism. Speaking of realism, the film was also really cleverly cast. All of the women in this film at the time of release were mostly unknown in their careers, and the film did well to find a variety of often underutilized accents in mainstream cinema. As a result, No one feels like a movie star. It just feels like a down-to-earth group of girls going on a holiday who you might have on Facebook. I should mention that's not an insult to their talent when I say they don't feel like movie stars, because they certainly perform with the quality of them. Performances in this film are top-notch. The women all feel like they have an actual familiarity to them and a history between them. The friendships in both their initial pleasant exchanges and joking and their desperate struggles and sometimes downfalls seem very sincere and honest. And boy, oh boy, do they do some good screaming. They sell terror and pain like they're actually experiencing it. This down-to-earth approach to casting and performance helps evoke that nightmarish quality even more, as when paired with the realistic set design, it feels less like you're watching a video and more like you just stumbled onto one of those aforementioned TikTok videos that took a rather intense turn. So if you think you can stomach a film so bleak and brutal, then I cannot recommend it enough. It's not just a good horror film, it's like one of the best there is. Easily a top 10 of the 2000s, easily. It's an important title too. Its influence on the genre since has been massive, and we're still seeing its effect on releases to this day. Fall, which came out only last year, features a remarkably similar plot, albeit just in the opposite direction. And I mean really similar, right down to things like characters being thrill seekers, the protagonist's love interest dying in the prologue, and friends reconnecting after one falls into a spiral of grief. Still a great film, by the way, just one of the many that has the Descent's DNA to thank for its existence. The Descent is a substantial piece of work. I will say as well, if you think the nihilism might be a bit much for you, the American release does have a slightly gentler ending than the UK version. I do mean slightly though. It ain't a happy time overseas either. There's just a little change they put in to soften the blow somewhat. It's still pretty damn grim though, but grim or not, it is fantastic. One of the few films to still manage to scare me after having grown massively desensitized to the genre. Its tension is at white knuckle levels. It's nail biting. I swear down, I am not even remotely exaggerating. Simply watching these women navigate through this dangerous architecture makes for some of the most terrifying images in cinema. And that's just them moving through the environment. Honestly, I remember catching it for the first time, and that initial turning point where a couple of the characters are tightly crammed in and stuck as a cave-in is likely about to happen. Oh man, it made me feel legitimately sick. I love it. And those of you that have seen it, you'll know that I've intentionally left a lot of details out of the description of this one, even though it might have made some of my analysis easier, but I did so intentionally, because for those of you that haven't seen it, this film has some surprises in store for you. You'll be shocked at how much variety and how much they're able to expand on this simple premise, and I don't want to give you any examples as to how, as you'll really benefit from going in blind. Trust me, I'm doing you a favour. It's amazing. So yeah, do go watch The Descent, but do not go into random dark holes you find in the ground. Seriously, cave divers, spelunkers, what is wrong with you? You are broken, strange, weird people. You do make really compelling TikToks though. Thanks again for watching. Once more, may I just remind you all that this year's Wholesome Halloween is being run in aid of the charity Trans Lifeline, which connects trans people to the community support and resources they need to survive and thrive. Please, if you can afford to, make a direct donation through the donation button attached to this video. You can also buy a Dan Drambles charity t-shirt at the link in the description, with 100% of the profits from that venture also going to the charity. Finally, if you'd like to support me and the channel directly, firstly, I've got a cool little discount code for you all. I'm actually become accredited advisor on the latest entry in the smash hit mega horror documentary franchise, In Search of Darkness. So if you'd like to pick up their newest title diving into early 90s horror, check out the code and link in the description. Secondly, I might still be in the running for the Face of Horror competition, so be sure to vote for me daily on there, once again, link in the description. And thirdly, I have a Patreon you can subscribe to, which will get you access to a bunch of exclusive features. And all of my Patreon takings and ad revenue for this month will go directly to Trans Lifeline as well. Anyway, that is all I have for you today. Hope you're enjoying the show, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you.